Welcome to Davenport. This territory is the ancestral home of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Wendat, and Mississaugas of the Credit, and we have obligations under Treaty 13. Canada isn't meeting them, and that's just one of the many reasons that so many voters are done with Justin Trudeau's all talk and no action approach. Fossil fuel subsidies are increasing, we're not meeting our emissions targets, and there's no commitment to raise the revenue that we need to invest in this community. I'm hearing every day that people are ready for better, and they're listening to Jagmeet Singh. They tell me he's speaking from the heart and we can trust him. And that's why I want to give the mic over to Canada's most respected and loved leader, Jagmeet Singh.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Bravo. Thank you, Alejandra. I'm blushing here, but thank you so much. It is an honor to be here with our incredible candidates and people that are affected directly by the housing crisis. And we want to talk about that today. We've seen since Mr. Trudeau has taken office that the housing crisis has only gotten worse. Since 2015 to present, the housing crisis, the national average price to buy a home has gone up by $300,000. It is the worst track record when it comes to affordability to buy a home in the OECD, all countries that are similar to Canada. In fact, rent has gone up. It is so hard to find a place that's in your budget. People can't even imagine buying a home. People can't even find a place they can rent. That's what we're up against. And it's only gotten worse since Mr. Trudeau has taken office. He broke his commitment to make sure he tackled the housing crisis, and people are paying the price of that. It's not a broken promise in a vacuum. It means people pay the price. We are committed to doing something different. We want to take on the big money and the big developers that are just trying to make profit off the housing market. We want to make sure that homes are for people. They can actually be in their budgets. We can do this. We can invest in building more homes that are affordable. We can invest in cooperatives. We can invest in not-for-profit housing. We can invest to build homes that people can actually afford to buy, and we can get the big money out of housing. We've got a plan to do that. People have a choice in this election. Mr. Trudeau, who's all for show, but continues to protect the interests of the super wealthy, or New Democrats who fight for you. We fought for you in the pandemic, and we will fight for you coming out of this. We will fight to make sure you have a home that you can afford. We will fight to invest in healthcare, and we are the only ones saying really clearly, we're going to tax the super wealthy with unlimited zeal to make sure they pay their fair share. On est ici pour parler du crise du logement et on sait que cette crise frappe fort, ça frappe fort à travers le pays. Et je veux dire clairement, M. Trudeau a promis de faire quelque chose pour faire face à cette crise. Mais son bilan est un des pires parmi les pays les mêmes pays, les pays similaires que le nôtre. Donc, on a vu depuis le temps qu'il est devenu Premier ministre, le montant pour acheter une maison a augmenté jusqu'à 300 000 $ par moyen à travers le pays. Donc, c'est le pire bilan et ça montre que ça coûte trop cher de continuer de voter pour M. Trudeau. Je dis clairement, on ne peut pas se permettre un 4 ans de plus de quelqu'un qui brise ses promesses, qui coûte trop cher. Vous avez un choix dans cette élection. M. Trudeau, qui donne des belles paroles, mais qui toujours protège les intérêts des ultra-riches, ou les néo-démocrates qui se battent pour vous, qui vont faire face à la crise climatique, aux crises du logement, qui vont investir dans votre avenir, dans les soins de santé, pour investir dans une assurance médicaments universelle, pour faire face à la crise climatique. Vous avez un choix. Thanks so much, folks. I also just want to take a moment to talk to Albertans. We have seen really troubling numbers of COVID-19 coming out of Alberta, and really deeply, deeply troubling news about people that are getting sick and the death toll because of COVID-19. And I want folks in Alberta to know we're here for you. We're going to push to call for the military and all supports possible to get out to Alberta to support the people. We're hearing from healthcare workers who have already been worked to the bone, who are saying that things are so desperate, now are saying that they don't know what's going to happen next because things are so bad there. The ICU units are already being overrun. People are having to make impossible choices about who gets care and who doesn't. And I want you to know, as we fought for you in this pandemic, we will fight for you coming out of this. We will fight for you. We should have never been in this election. Mr. Trudeau should have never called it. looking at what's happening in Alberta is another example of why we cannot trust Mr. Trudeau's leadership. He chose to call an election, a selfish election, for no reason, and that put our efforts to fight the pandemic in jeopardy. That put people's lives at risk. We had called 22 times to expand paid sick leave, something that all experts agree would have helped keep people safe so people didn't have to go into work. And he said no to workers every single time, only to announce it in the midst of a campaign after saying no 22 times. That is not the leadership we need to get through this pandemic. You can trust New Democrats to fight for you. Merci, and with that, I'm ready for any questions you might have.
En français, s'il te plaît.
Je vais parler directement aux gens qui habitent en Alberta. Je sais que la situation est tellement dangereuse à ce moment. Les chiffres augmentent. On a parlé avec les travailleurs de santé de première ligne qui ont dit, ils ont dit que c'était déjà un temps tellement difficile. Mais ce qu'on a appris maintenant, c'est le fait que les gens morts à cause de la COVID-19, les hôpitaux sont pleins de gens à cause de la quatrième vague qui frappe fort. Je veux dire clairement que c'est une autre raison pour laquelle on n'aurait dû pas déclencher une élection. M. Trudeau a fait une erreur. C'était une mauvaise décision. Ce n'est pas de leadership de déclencher une élection quand la quatrième vague de la COVID-19 frappe fort. Et maintenant, ça frappe fort en Alberta. On aurait pu faire des choses différemment pour protéger les populations, pour livrer l'aide. Un exemple, c'est on a demandé l'expansion d'un programme de congé des maladies payées 22 fois. Et 22 fois, M. Trudeau a dit non, malgré le fait que c'était un programme essentiel pour sauver les vies pendant cette pandémie. Il a dit non aux travailleurs et travailleuses. Ce n'est pas le leadership. Si vous voulez le leadership qui défend les gens, qui protège la population, c'est nous les néo-démocrates. Merci. On est là pour vous.
First question, Annie Bergeron-Oliver, CTV News.
Hi, Mr. Singh.
Hey there.
Alberta is now in a state of public health emergency. I'm wondering if you think it's still appropriate for candidates to be going door to door in their campaign. And I'm wondering if you've changed your advice to candidates, told them not to do that.
Given the recent news of what's going on in Alberta, we are changing our approach there. I again want to say to Albertans, this did not have to be this way. Mr. Trudeau called an election when he should have been working on helping people. We've been saying from the beginning we should have been in Ottawa getting help to people. You can count on us to fight for you. I want you to know that we're going to push to get every resource possible sent out to Alberta to get you the help that you need. We will be there for you. We have fought for you in the pandemic. We will fight for you in this crisis right now, and we will fight for you to get out of this.
You didn't really answer my question. You said that you were changing your approach, but you didn't provide specifics. So can you specifically say what the approach is going to be different and how? And you also blame Mr. Trudeau, but isn't it Mr. Kenney's fault, the premier, given that he didn't enact lockdowns or vaccine passports and had a completely open summer, which yesterday he actually apologized for and said that was the wrong approach?
Well, there's no question that Mr. Kenney is to blame here and that his leadership has been horrible. But it doesn't also dismiss the fact that Mr. Trudeau called an election while the fourth wave was hitting hard, while everyone knew that it was going to hit, and while he said no 22 times to bringing in an expansion of paid sick leave. He said no to workers. People lost their life because of that. People could have benefited from that paid sick leave right now. And now he announces it in a cynical way, the height of cynicism in the middle of an election. That's a failure of leadership. The federal government can't sit by and watch as people lose their lives. I believe in leadership as finding solutions, not looking for excuses. And Mr. Trudeau was selfish in calling this election. Absolutely, Mr. Kenney is to blame. Mr. Trudeau contributed to the problem by calling the election.
Prochaine question, Jean-Sébastien Cloutier.
Pour enchaîner sur la question de Annie, pour ce qui concerne l'Alberta, vous attaquez Justin Trudeau. Or, Erin O'Toole a beaucoup moins d'exigences par rapport au passeport. Le gouvernement provincial en Alberta est conservateur. On a vraiment l'impression que stratégiquement, c'est les libéraux que vous voulez attaquer et non les conservateurs, alors que dans ce cas-ci, on pourrait facilement reprocher aux conservateurs plus qu'aux libéraux ce qui se passe.
C'est clairement un manque de leadership en Alberta du part de M. Kenney et on doit le blâmer, absolument pas de doute. Mais M. Trudeau a une responsabilité aussi. Il est le Premier ministre et le Premier ministre a décidé d'avoir une élection pour les raisons égoïstes au lieu de continuer de faire le travail pour aider les gens dans cette pandémie. Ce qui est pire encore, c'est le fait qu'on a eu une vote dans la Chambre de communes. Et dans cette vote, on a dit que est-ce qu'on doit avoir une élection pendant cette pandémie, oui ou non? M. Trudeau lui-même a voté non. On ne doit pas avoir une élection pendant cette pandémie. Plus que 300 députés ont voté non, on ne doit pas avoir une élection pendant cette pandémie. Et il a brisé sa promesse. Et ça coûte cher parce que si on était au Parlement à Ottawa, on aurait pu continuer de le travail. On aurait pu livrer plus d'aide. On aurait pu passer des projets de loi pour aider les gens. Donc oui, je blâme le Premier ministre. Et c'était M. Trudeau. Oui, je le blâme pour déclencher une élection au lieu d'aider les gens. Déclencher une élection égoïste. Oui, bien sûr. Et les gens payent les prix pour ces décisions. Notre offre, c'est on est là pour vous. On est toujours montré comment on se bat pour les gens et on va continuer de le faire.
Et en sous-question, justement, vous dites on est là pour vous. On voit que cette pandémie-là, malgré la vaccination, qui est très élevée, n'est pas finie, que les vaccins ne sont peut-être pas la seule solution, visiblement. Qu'est-ce que vous feriez comme premier ministre pour améliorer la situation quand vous dites on sera là pour vous?
Quelques mesures, on a déjà dit on pense qu'un outil par rapport aux experts essentiel pour faire face à cette pandémie, c'est le fait que quand les gens tombent malades, ils doivent avoir les moyens de rester chez eux. Et la meilleure façon de le faire par rapport aux médecins, les travailleurs de santé, c'est un programme de congé des maladies payées. Donc, on a demandé ça 22 fois depuis 18 mois qu'on a besoin d'un programme de congé des maladies qui fonctionne et c'est exactement ce qu'on va faire. On va s'assurer qu'il n'y a aucune personne au Canada qui doit faire une décision impossible entre aller au travail malade ou rester chez eux sans avoir le paye parce qu'ils n'ont pas accès au congé des maladies payées. Donc, ça, c'est une chose. Deuxièmement, on a déjà dit qu'un passeport vaccinal, c'est essentiel. On aurait dû le faire il y a plusieurs mois, mais c'est quelque chose qu'on encore pense que c'est important de faire. On pense que le gouvernement fédéral a un rôle à jouer pour aider dans la vaccination de le reste de la population, pour promouvoir comment c'est important, pour le rendre plus facile pour avoir accès au vaccin, parce qu'on sait qu'il y a plusieurs personnes qui veulent être vaccinées, mais qui n'ont pas accès. J'ai parlé avec Hawa dans son comté, il y a des problèmes d'accès parce qu'il n'y avait pas beaucoup des endroits pour avoir la vaccination. Donc, il y a plusieurs choses qu'on peut faire et on va continuer de le faire. Aussi, on est prêt de continuer l'aide aux gens. Dans une pandémie qui frappe fort, on doit avoir accès aux aides financières directes pour les gens qui doivent rester chez eux à cause de cette pandémie. On va continuer de se battre pour les gens.
Next question, Karina Roman, CBC News.
Good morning.
Morning.
You want to be Prime Minister. Would you have intervened, even though it's not federal jurisdiction, and acted to make sure Alberta didn't end up in this health crisis? You know, as the decisions are being made, there are lots of warnings that this is where they would end up. Would you have intervened, whether that means using, you know, invoking the Emergencies Act or something else? Would you have intervened?
We were open to using any tools possible to help and to support in the fight against COVID-19. The difference between me and Mr. Trudeau is that I believe that we have to play an active role and not to sit back and say our only job is to secure vaccines and that's it. I believe in a crisis, you have to find ways to help out, find ways to support, be more proactive in that solution, more proactive in aiding. The major thing that we could have done that would have clearly helped people, and what experts have said is one of the most important tools, is a paid sick leave program that's expanded and that works properly. We've been calling for that 22 times. And 22 times, Mr. Trudeau said no. And the thing is, he realized that it was something that we should have done because he promised it in the middle of an election. So for 18 months, he said no. 22 times, he said no to workers, to people, knowing that that was one of the most important tools to keep people safe. That would have helped in Alberta. That would have saved lives across Canada. There's many things we would have done differently. Paid sick leave, a proactive role in helping people get vaccinated, a hands-on approach instead of a hands-off approach, always working with provinces and territories, but being more proactive and understanding that in a crisis, it's not enough to just say, oh, that's my job and that's it. You've got to be involved in finding every solution possible.
just point out you didn't answer the question about the Emergencies Act, so I still put that out there as a question for you. But Kenny's admission yesterday, that he made a mistake, yet we have Aaron O'Toole, who at one point praised Kenny's approach and has not been as fully supportive of vaccine passports or mandatory vaccinations, certainly. Could you support a Conservative minority government if that leader is not on the same page as you in terms of vaccine passports and mandatory vaccinations?
Well, I put my position out there really clear. I believe absolutely that we need to get vaccinated. I believe in vaccine passports. We've seen how they work. But when we talk about leadership, the Conservatives have absolutely failed. There's no question about it. Mr. Kenny is a failure in leadership, and the people of Alberta are suffering sadly because of that failure. There's no question about it. But Mr. Trudeau is a failure as well. Let's not forget, he called an election. He decided, knowing full well, with all the evidence we had, there wasn't a potential fourth wave. There was a for sure fourth wave going to happen. And he decided to call an election instead of continuing to help people out. That is a colossal failure of leadership. He knew, because we all knew, experts had made it really clear that paid sick leave is one of the most important tools to keep people safe and to save lives. He would mock every time we asked the question, expand that program. Despite the fact that we had already put in place a federal program that we fought for and we said it's not working, he would mock those questions. 22 times we asked the question and he mocked it. And now, in the midst of a campaign, he announced that he would do it now. That's cynical leadership. That's leadership that hurts people, and people pay the price for that leadership.
Good morning, Mr. Singh. Sorry if you've answered this question before, but
No problem.
you're talking about your affordable housing program today, and it would be paid for, in part at least, by 60 billion over 5 years in a wealth tax. The Parliamentary Budget Officer, when they calculated that number, said there would be a behavioural response and discounted the wealth estimates of many of the wealthiest families by 35%. Why should Canadians have any confidence in numbers that look vague at best?
We are proposing things that haven't been done in a long time, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. In this pandemic, we've seen who's struggled and who hasn't. We've seen that families have had a tough time, that people lost their jobs. We've seen that small businesses have struggled. But you know who didn't struggle? The billionaires, the Amazons of this world. The wealthiest Canadians, the 44 richest billionaires who increased their wealth by 78 billion. They didn't struggle. And for a long time, they haven't been paying their fair share. So we're proposing some real concrete measures that would end the loopholes, end the offshore tax havens, and the fact that Canadian companies that make profits in Canada hide that profit in an offshore bank in another country and don't pay their fair share. We are proposing making sure that they actually start contributing their fair share, and we know it's possible. It's not been done before recently, but there wasn't a long time ago that the wealthiest did pay their fair share. And recently, even Mr. Biden, President Biden, has put forward a plan which looks like he's copied a bunch of our initiatives because it includes change on the capital gains, it includes our tax on the wealthiest, and it is a direction that the world is heading in. We know that there is something very unfair about someone being a billionaire, being able to use an offshore tax haven or not paying their fair share. We want to fix that problem.
Just moving on to in repeated elections, progressives have deserted the NDP in the final days of the campaign. Are you better prepared this time around?
We have a strong case to make to Canadians because we've got a lot of examples, and we want Canadians to know that while you're making this tough decision, and a lot of people are making this tough decision, they're starting to look at the fact that Mr. Trudeau has done things that aren't backed up with his actions. He kind of does things for show, and then doesn't follow through with them, and then people are paying the price for that. An example: he promised to take on the climate crisis, and he has the worst record of the G7 nations. He promised to end fossil fuel subsidies, and then he increased them to higher than the Harper Conservatives level. So people see that, and they see the price that they're paying. The climate crisis continues, the forest fires continue. With housing, people are feeling the impact of Mr. Trudeau's all-for-show approach, but he's not willing to take on the big wealthy investors or the rich developers because housing prices continue to go up, and that means families cannot afford to find a place that's in their budget. People are paying the price for his inaction, and so people are making this choice. They're thinking, well, Mr. Trudeau's all for show, We need someone who's going to fight for us, who's actually going to take on the super wealthy, and that's New Democrats.
Next question, Alex Bowling on the Toronto Star.
Just on the this controversy around the debate question and the leaders, including yourself, as I understand it, calling on the consortium to apologize for that question. What exactly in the phrasing of that question did you find to be objectionable?
As someone who's been spent a lot of my life fighting systemic discrimination and systemic racism, the suggestion that it's a problem in only one province actually hurts the fight, because systemic racism exists everywhere in Canada. Indigenous communities are living the realities of systemic discrimination, of systemic racism, and they are feeling that everywhere in Canada. Lack of clean drinking water would never happen in a major city. It's systemic racism that allows a system to continue that denies clean drinking water to Indigenous people. That is a system that exists everywhere in Canada, and it is hurtful to the fight to suggest that it is only in one province. Carding, which was a horrible practice that meant that people were being stopped just because of the color of their skin, happened in the most egregious form here in Toronto. So it's important to acknowledge that it's not in one province or one territory, it's everywhere. And it is better for the fight against systemic racism that people understand that it's not localized to one city, one community, one province. It's a problem that happens everywhere, and people suffer everywhere.
But the question was about specific laws that have passed in Quebec, Bill 21, framing it as a discriminatory law. Do you believe that's a discriminatory law? And is it controversial to call it a discriminatory law?
Oh, there's no question that this law divides people and is discriminatory. The approach to Quebec, though, can't be that that's the only place where there's discrimination, where there's systemic discrimination, where there's systemic racism. We feel that and live that everywhere in this country. And it's important to acknowledge that it's a problem everywhere, and it's important to acknowledge that we've got to take it on everywhere.
Next question, Olivia Stefanovich, CBC News.
Good morning, Mr. Singh. I'd like to hear this from you. Do you think Canada can meet its emissions targets with the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion operating?
I think that Canada has to take a hard look at where we are investing our money and change our approach. And that means looking at investing in renewable energy. That means ending fossil fuel subsidies. That means not voting Mr. Trudeau, who's had the worst track record in the history or in the G7 nations. And that means supporting New Democrats who believe that we can fight the climate crisis and create good jobs. That means changing where we spend our resources. That means a whole of government approach instead of just a market-based approach, which is what the Liberals are suggesting. We need to have a price on pollution that doesn't exempt the biggest polluters, as Mr. Trudeau has done. And it means that we need to invest in that renewable economy that we know is possible.
Okay, the question was whether Canada would meet its emissions targets with the TMX operating. I don't understand why you're having such a hard time answering that question. We are 3 days away from Election Day, Mr. Singh. Why can't you take a clear position on what you will do with TMX? Progressive voters are looking not for you to assess it, but to kill it. Why won't you do that?
Progressive voters are looking at who's going to fight the climate crisis, and they're looking at the choices they have. And they're looking at Mr. Trudeau, who's done a lot of things for show, who's promised to end the fossil fuel subsidies and instead has increased them by $900 million. They're looking at Mr. Trudeau, who's promised to reduce emissions and set targets that he's missed every single year. They're looking at Mr. Trudeau and other options and looking at the fact that he promised or he put a price on pollution that exempted the biggest polluters. We're saying on each one of those, we would end fossil fuel subsidies. We would take on the big polluters. We would reduce our emissions. We have laid out a clear path, and Canadians are going to make a choice between Mr. Trudeau, who's all for show but not willing to take on the biggest polluters, or New Democrats who are going to fight for you, who are going to fight this climate crisis like we really want to win.
But why can't you commit to killing the TMX expansion?
Next question, Menaka Raman-Wilms from the Globe and Mail.
Hello, Mr. Singh.
Hey there.
The Globe and Mail reported today that the US, the UK, and Australia have joined a new defense pact meant to contain China's military might. But Canada is not part of this new pact. If you were to form government, as you do say, would you ask to join this new defense pact to contain Chinese expansionism? And what do you see as the pitfalls of us not joining?
I read the headline today, and I was thinking about the fact that Canada was absent in this. And this is a really important decision being made. And another reason why we shouldn't have been in this election. While these important decisions are being made, Mr. Trudeau decided to call an election instead. Instead of being involved in the negotiations and the decisions around this, Mr. Trudeau is absent. Another reason why we should not have been in this election, we should have been working on this. We know that Mr. Spavor, Mr. Kovrig are still detained in China, still denied human rights. These are Canadians that we want to return to home, return to Canada. And we've been saying we need to be involved in working with our allies to apply more pressure on China to make sure that they return these Canadians. This pact seems like a potential avenue to apply more pressure, but Canada was absent. Another reason why this election should not have been called.
And back to Alberta, which we've talked a bit about this morning. They've just announced new restrictions and vaccine passports to deal with the surge of COVID-19. Trudeau has been pushing for mandatory vaccines from very early on. Do you think that the situation in Alberta now will lead to more support for him at the end of this campaign because of that?
Well, I want folks to know, while I clearly condemn the leadership of Mr. Kenney, I also condemn the leadership of Mr. Trudeau. Both Conservatives and Liberals have failed in this case. Mr. Kenney clearly did not show leadership and did not make the right decisions, and people are paying the price of that. Mr. Trudeau called an election in the midst of a fourth wave, an election that did not need to happen. We had 2 more years on our mandate, and he had also voted in Parliament saying that we should not have a pandemic election. We put that vote, that was a vote that was put to all of us, over 300, I think it's 327 MPs voted to say, no, we should not have an election in this pandemic. He was one of them. And he broke that commitment. He knew that it was not a good idea to have an election in the pandemic. He knew about the fourth wave, and despite that, called it. And right now, we could be in Ottawa, passing legislation to help out Albertans, making decisions to help out Alberta, to help the people that are struggling right now, the people that are afraid right now. We could be there helping them. But instead, we're in the midst of an election that Mr. Trudeau called for no reason. A selfish election that he still has yet to explain why we're in it. And so I blame Mr. Trudeau's leadership as well.
Sorry. Next question, we have Robin Gill from Global News.
Good morning, Mr. Singh.
Good morning.
Yesterday, Global News learned that the military justice system can't hold Canada's most powerful generals accountable. Essentially, General Vance cannot be tried. What would you do to improve the military justice system?
This is so outrageously unjust. It is so wrong that someone has allegations that should be tried that can't be because of a technicality. And what makes it even worse is that we knew about this in 2015. 6 years ago, Justice Deschamps wrote a report that outlined the serious problems, a climate that was dangerous to women in the Canadian Armed Forces, and outlined a specific solution. She said we need an independent process anytime harassment happens, sexual harassment or violence, there needs to be an independent process. That was her #1 primary recommendation 6 years ago. You'll all recall that in 2015, Mr. Trudeau became Prime Minister. He sat on that primary recommendation to have an independent process for 6 years. And at the end, when he called an election, his decision was not to implement that primary recommendation to put in an independent process. He ordered another inquiry with another justice of the Supreme Court. That is outrageous, that is insulting, and that sends a horrible message to women that they're not being listened to, that they're not able to come forward. And that doesn't just send that message in the Canadian Armed Forces, it sends it across Canada. If the highest office of this land is going to ignore the problems faced by women, then where would women ever find any justice?
What's your #1 solution for the housing crisis in Canada, especially since we're in one of the hottest and largest markets in Canada?
Two-prong approach. One, we've got to get the big money out of housing. People are speculating, property flipping. We're seeing foreign investment driving up the cost of housing. So we've got to get that pressure out of the market, get that big money out of the market. And we've got 2 ways to do that. One, a foreign buyer's tax. Second, change the capital gains that would discourage the existing incentive in property flipping. And then the second approach is to invest massively in building homes that are affordable, building more cooperatives, building and supporting not-for-profit projects, incentivizing the building of truly affordable homes, using federal land in cities strictly for the building of affordable homes and affordable housing, not as Mr. Trudeau tried to do luxury condos, something that we pushed back and fought and won. We believe that we need to take on this crisis with all the resources we can.
Next question, Kelly Malone, the Canadian Press.
To follow up on my colleague's question from much earlier, can you explain the details of how your campaign will change in Alberta? And will candidates still be door knocking?
We are making that assessment right now, and we're looking at what the change should happen. Given how bad things are, given the recent information, our team is making that assessment. But things are really bad right now, and we shouldn't have been in this position in the first place. Mr. Trudeau should have never called this election. We should have been in Ottawa working on how we can help people out. The people of Alberta are suffering right now, and they need our support. We want folks to know we're going to fight for you. We're going to make sure you get the help you need. We're going to be making calls and pushes to get the military and every resource possible to get out, healthcare professionals and other resources to get out there to help you out.
Would the NDP ever be open to taxing capital gains on primary residences? And if not, why? Do you think it's time to consider rethinking retirement plans that are based on home ownership? And if so, why not tax capital gains?
Absolutely not. That would never happen under a new Democrat government. We're never going to tax primary homes. You can be absolutely sure of that. But we are absolutely going to go after property flippers. People that flip properties and use our housing market as a stock market, yes, we're going to discourage that. We're going to stop that. We think that's hurtful to the housing market. We're going to go after foreign investment. We don't think people should have to compete with multi-million-dollar, multi-billion-dollar corporations in purchasing their home. So we're absolutely going to get the big money out of housing, but we will not in any way target primary home ownership, not at all.
Next question, Mackenzie Gray, CTV News.
Good morning, Mr. Singh.
Morning.
Do you think it would be appropriate for federal leaders to go to Alberta in the final days of the campaign to campaign?
That's an assessment that we're looking at right now. It's an important question and an important assessment to make. Throughout this pandemic, we've been saying that this is one of the problems we're up against. A decision to call an election in the midst of a pandemic has serious implications on people's health, but specifically it also has implications on democracy, ability to get out and communicate our message and talk to people and give people a real choice. These are decisions that Mr. Trudeau knew about, and Mr. Trudeau still called an election. It was a wrong decision, and we're going to make an assessment about what is the best thing to do and what's the safest thing to do.
Just want to go back to the question that my colleague from the Globe and Mail asked. I don't think you really answered it. If you were Prime Minister, and you tell us every day you're running to be Prime Minister, do you think that Canada, or would you try to get Canada part of the deal that the US, the UK signed today, and with Australia as well, to try and curb China's influence?
Well, the principle of making sure that China follows through on human rights and the critique around their treatment of the Uyghur and of people that are raising democratic rights in Hong Kong, those things are things we've criticized, we've denounced, and we've said for a long time we need to work with our allies to apply more pressure on China to secure the release of Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Spavor, as well as to follow through on human rights. This specific accord, we were not involved in negotiation, weren't involved in the details, and so it's hard to make an assessment without knowing the details of the accord and how those negotiations were reached. But the principles of working with our allies to be able to put pressure on China is something I absolutely support. And the fact that we are not a part of this accord and we were not involved in it is another reason why this was a bad decision to have this election. Canada should have been involved in those discussions and should have been involved in making that decision. But we don't know anything about that because Mr. Trudeau had called an election instead.
En français, s'il te plaît.
J'ai déjà dit à plusieurs reprises que j'appuie l'idée de mettre la pression sur la Chine à cause des problèmes, des violations des droits de la personne, les inquiétudes par rapport à la communauté ouïghour et aussi les gens qui se battent pour la démocratie en Hong Kong. Donc on a déjà dit qu'on critique l'approche de la Chine et qu'on doit travailler avec nos alliés pour mettre la pression sur la Chine, premièrement aussi pour retourner nos Canadiens, M. Spavor et M. Kovrig, qui sont dans les prisons en Chine depuis plus de 1000 jours. Donc, on a déjà dit ça et on continue d'avoir cette position. Mais le fait que cet accord était signé par les autres pays, comme l'Angleterre et l'Australie, c'est un autre exemple pour lequel on n'aurait dû pas déclencher une élection Et une autre raison pour laquelle M. Trudeau était tort pour déclencher une élection, parce qu'on n'était pas dans cette négociation, cette discussion. On ne sait pas les détails et pourquoi on n'est pas parti de cet accord. Une autre raison pour laquelle M. Trudeau n'aurait dû pas déclencher cette élection.
This concludes our press conference. Thank you. Merci.
Thanks so much. Merci.